Friends, I thank the Madras Bar Association for being able to share a few thoughts on a subject about which much has been written and spoken, but which does require a new dimension, having regard to the events which have transpired in the past few days. Before I begin this dialogue, I wish to pay my respectful homage to all the people who have encountered this deadly disease, COVID-19, and have perished from this world. It has been one of the most inconsolable tragedies, and one is only reminded of the fact that in 1918-19, we had the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu caused a loss of humanity to the extent of 1 to 2%. Roughly 20 million people died in India, primarily in Punjab, Bombay, and in certain parts of Western India. We must not forget that there was a major drought coupled with grain exports, which resulted in food shortage. There was also a sinister connection between flu, virus, and malnutrition. COVID-19 may still have a strong tale to tell in South Asia and Africa. The magazines on 15th March 2020, particularly Science, warned that Africa is a ticking time bomb. Richard Preston made a non-fiction film in 1994 which was called The Hot Zone. It spoke of an exterminating animal which was born in a mysterious bat cave in Central Africa called Ebola. We know that the Ebola virus was followed by the avian influenza. It jumped to human beings in 1997. SARS appeared in 2002, and both of them at Guangdong, which was one of the world's largest manufacturing facilities. In 2011, Steven Soderbergh made a film called Contagion, but who would believe that it would stand at our door facing us? Sequencing course COV2 was simple, but still all bits of information are not available to us. Researchers are working day and night all over the world. We must also bear in mind there is no conclusive clarity about how people who recover are testing positive, and there are many pieces of the mystery which are yet to be resolved. We must also bear in mind there is a shortage of testing kits. It prevents sometimes accurate estimates of key parameters about the reproduction rate, the size of the infected population, and the number of infections. It also has the capacity to mutate like any other virus. So why am I talking about democracy and constitution today? In order to bring that to some light, the uncertainty which has been caused by COVID-19 is very hard to measure. And when we are facing such uncertainty, apart from relying upon our inner resources, we also need to collectively look at what is available conceptually in terms of togetherness. We are connected with each other through the fabric of democracy, and we're also connected under a constitution. COVID-19 has created an uncertainty worse than a war, and today we are facing a humanitarian crisis. We also have to know that livelihoods are at peril, which has triggered an exodus of migrant workers, and the effects of economic disruptions have to be minimized. The International Monetary Fund launched a policy tracker on 24 March 2020 to help member countries to be informed about the experience of others in fighting the pandemic and the discretionary policies which were taken to help them to combat the pandemic more effectively. In India, the fiscal monetary policy response has come subsequently. Unlike Singapore and South Korea, India has opted for a complete lockdown, occasioned by the fact that aggressive testing requires great resources and also the time gained to plot route maps and scale up public health infrastructure and services in the meanwhile. As far as the economic measures are concerned, it may be somewhat out of place to deal with it at this point of view. But I did see considerable merit in the suggestion of a former finance minister, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who did say that the threshold levels of fiscal deficit may have to be even altered. The Reserve Bank of India has announced extraordinary stimulus packages in a very effective and cogent manner. People are at work. There is no doubt that the level of responsibility displayed by the political class as a whole has been extremely reassuring. It is a benchmark which they will be judged by. The ability to put aside narrow differences and work towards the common good of all people is indeed a benchmark which will be etched in our history. But this is only a benchmark worth looking at if certain safeguards are taken into account. I will have an opportunity to speak about it. When I speak about democracy and the Constitution, when the Constitution was enacted, we did have the benefit of experiences of many other countries, and the way the Constitution evolved and the way the Constitution was enacted and how was it being interpreted. But today, there is a certain need for internationalism as well. There is the need for interstate cooperation on biosecurity, climate change, and the inescapable reality of a common ecological fate for all mankind ought to have prompted, in fact, major powers to craft new norms earlier. It is a biocrisis like a phantom epidemic, which spreads in the shadows, and we are at an inflection point. Even though we might retreat into our national shell to maintain sheer survival, the dust will eventually settle, and the opportunity for a radical shift in the discourse must not be lost. I make this point because under democracy, we look not only in terms of being a part of a nation, but we also look at ourselves as responsible citizens in an international being of humanity. The priority at the moment is to prevent the disease from reaching the critical stage of community spread. While wider testing is essential, forging a discipline in the disease tracking and tackling system is equally important. The virus may shatter the very foundation of our lives, causing not only immense amount of suffering, but also great economic havoc, conceivably worse than the Great Depression. The new normal will have to be constructed on the ruins of the past. We will find ourselves possibly in a new condition. It will not be enough to treat the endemic as an unfortunate accident, to get rid of its consequences and to return to the smooth functioning of the old way of doing things. We will have to raise the key question of how do we deal with the new situation in a different way. Why did I choose democracy and constitution to speak today? What would have happened if, in fact, many of the fundamental rights which are a part of our Part 3 was actually, shall we say, the accepted norm of human rights and governmental accountability? This is an important point to consider. Li Wenliang, the doctor who first discovered the case in the ongoing coronavirus epidemic, was censored by state authorities. He will remain an authentic hero of our time. His death rightly triggered widespread anger. In fact, if freedom of speech and other basic rights were respected, greater information and transparency would have led to containing the virus. It only tells us how important human rights are. The authority of the state being used against ecological activists, students, religious preachers, publishers is only very counterproductive and is often to send out a message because nothing needs to be proven against them. Dr. Lee, from his hospital bed, said a few moments before his death, "There should be more than one voice in a healthy society. There needs to be an open space for citizens' critical reactions to circulate. A mutual trust and respect between ordinary people and the state is important. The fact that large sections of population in India have heeded the advice of governments and the call of the Prime Minister indicate that at this moment this trust is implicit. To maintain that regard, however, government will be expected to demonstrate great care and continued reflection. It is creditable that the political leadership in India has now proclaimed that virus has no race, no religion, no caste. It could attach to anybody. Often it is said that freedom of speech is incapable of separation between what is called good freedom of speech and bad rumors. One thing is clear, that market mechanisms may not be enough to prevent chaos and hunger. Hence, what were traditionally viewed, sometimes contemptuously, as socialist measures may have to be considered even at a global level. Coordination of production and distribution may have to take place even outside the coordinates of the market. In 1840, there was a huge potato famine in Ireland. It devastated Ireland. It caused millions to die. But the British state still believed in market mechanisms and exported food from Ireland. I never forget H.G. Wells in The War of the Worlds when he wrote a story about Martians, how they conquered the earth, and suddenly they were all killed by an onslaught of earthly pathogens because they had no immunity. Look at the irony today. A person from United States meets somebody in Singapore. He goes to UK. He suddenly leaves for a skiing holiday in France. And suddenly everybody is infected. The really difficult thing to accept is that the ongoing epidemic is a result of natural contingency at its purest. I must counsel that we should not look for deeper meanings than this. In the larger order of things, we're just a species with no special importance. Thus, we have to be anti-Darwinian in our approach for protecting society. I mean, Darwinian evolutionary biology is very different from the attitude as a society. That is why I called it anti-Darwinian. As Martin Luther King put it more than half a century ago, we may have all come in different ships, but we are in the same boat now. We are also products of a burnt-out society, driven by a demand to persevere and not to fail. We are goaded by the ambition of efficiency. We are now exploiting laborers in our own enterprises. I will return to the inappropriateness of a Darwinian view of human relations later, in this conversation. Let us remember that the coronavirus pandemic could never have been prevented. The information could have been prevented, The information was there to prevent it. In October 2019, even before the outbreak, there was large-scale simulation in the United States of a possible pandemic of this kind, but very little was done. It was only on the 31st of December that China informed the WHO of pneumonia-like symptoms with unknown origins. 1 week later, they called it a coronavirus. They sequenced it and provided information to the world. Let us ask, if Noam Chomsky is right, do we go right back to the essence of markets, being exacerbated by the savage neoliberal intensification of deep social economic problems? Even though a state like Kerala has been a hotspot, it quickly flattened the curve. That was possible only on account of social mobilization and state responses, and which together effect a social democracy. Social democracies always involve a sort of social pact with a political commitment. The political commitment is to provide basic welfare and broad-based opportunity to all citizens. This social pact, in my view, is the soul and heart of our Constitution. Social citizenship must drive reforms. It must strengthen legal and institutional capacity for public action. The very basis of the public interest litigation theory propounded by Justices Krishna Iyer in Bhagwati was based upon the rights-based welfare society and the need that a vibrant, organized civil society derives continuous accountability from frontline state actors. Our Constitution is a charter for human flourishing. It is a humanist constitution. Its purpose is to ensure the creation and maintenance of a state which is a defender of human dignity and personhood. To do so, the Constitution envisages a state which is committed to the service of the people in ordinary times and especially in times of distress. To achieve this end, it chooses the vehicle of democracy. This humanist character of our Constitution is a feature that makes the Indian Constitution unique amongst its contemporaries. As Justice Krishna Iyer put it in 1978, India embraces a compassionate constitutionalism. When we say that our system is a humanist one, committed to a compassionate constitutionalism, we must think of two things. The first is that independent India rejects colonialism and imperial projects and the social Darwinism that unavoidably inflected them. Let me trace the genealogy of this very powerful and terribly misguided idea. At the height of British imperialism in 1859, Charles Darwin's work in evolutionary biology called Origin of the Species was published. In it, Darwin argued that the scarcity of natural resources leads to competition among individuals in the animal kingdom, and he called this as the struggle for survival. Through this competition, natural selection would take place, and the best adapted members of a species are most likely to reproduce and pass their beneficial adaptations on to their offspring. Poorly adapted members, the weaker members of the population, would not survive. This idea of the struggle for survival began to grow in popularity. Herbert Spencer, another British intellectual, coined the phrase survival of the fittest, which Darwin adopted in later editions of his work. This notion came to be used to construct the theory of social Darwinism, which extended Darwin's ideas to human and civilizational development, though Darwin himself never did so. By using the logics of natural selection and survival of the fittest, colonists, races, even the Third Reich developed political ideologies to justify the disenfranchisement and servitude of entire peoples and civilizations, and to wash away any moral culpability for their extractive attitudes in relation to those who were oppressed. In this way, the colonized natives of Asia and Africa was less evolved than the imperial forces of civilized Europe, and it was only natural that they must submit to the control of their colonizers. The second way in which we display a commitment to a compassionate constitutionalism is in electing to regulate economic activity and set up a welfare state. Indeed, many may argue that absolute laissez-faire capitalism of the kind that birthed Standard Oil Company's unprecedented monopoly in the United States in the early 20th century, for example, was also justified by the brutal logic of social Darwinism and the survival of the fittest. Since that time, we know that social Darwinism never yielded human flourishing. In Why Nations Fail, two great academics, Professors Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, in 2012 explained why some nations prosper and the others do not. They contrast two types of political and economic institutions, inclusive and extractive, which they describe in the following terms. Extractive political institutions concentrate power in the hands of a narrow elite and place few constraints on the exercise of power. Economic institutions are then structured by this elite to extract resources from the rest of society. In other words, they exist in order to enrich the elite by ensuring the transfer of society's wealth into their hands or overseas bank accounts. Inclusive political institutions, vesting power broadly, that is, pluralistic institutions which encourage economic growth, would tend to uproot economic institutions that expropriate the resources of the many, erect entry barriers, and suppress the functioning of the markets so that only a few benefit. In other words, they do not exist to enrich the elite at the expense of society. While taking up the issue of social Darwinism, first of all, we must understand a few elements of this expression, democracy. Democracy was intended to be not chaotic. It was intended to give all human beings a sense of power over themselves, but also to allow them to have a shared ability to come to rational decisions. In order to effectuate democracy, you needed to have a contract both among yourselves and also with those to whom you would delegate authority, and in order to enable that, we have the Constitution. Just as the law begins and ends with human behavior, the ends of the Constitution also focus on human flourishing, and the Constitution is intended to channel democratic conduct. So in order to be suitable and effective, we must have a clear vision of our condition. If we were to be able to look at this through the prism of evolutionary psychology, I would suggest the following. The basic blueprint of the engine of evolution was drawn by Darwin, literally 120 years ago. In modern times, it has usually been confined to biological or neutral sciences. However, a possibility arose whether it could be introduced even to trace cultural values through social Darwinism. This was attacked by critics, and it was possibly justified in the light of the eugenically justified atrocities in the Second World War. After that, again in 1960s, the spotlight arose on evolutionary principles. But now it arose under a different name called sociobiology. And once again, there were contradictory conclusions. Then we had that packaged or repackaged as evolutionary psychology. Now, is Darwinism an analytical mechanism? This is an important question. Evolutionary principles, first of all, may not be applicable and are not intended to be applicable to human behavior. The need to adapt is very different from the strongest to actually vanquish the weakest, which is why there is the need in democracy as well as a constitution to be anti-Darwinian in terms of conduct, while knowing that the Darwinian principle may explain the existence or evolution of man. Now, in the evolution theory, we are all very clear that it is built on three pillars: variation, heritability, and differential fitness. Our constitution has provided that none of these must ever actually lead to a differentiating treatment. The non-discriminatory treatment with reference to birth is embedded in the Indian constitution, and it is a fundamentally anti-Darwinian trait which is a part of civilization. Therefore, while there could be natural variations on account of birth, we have to consider that what is the chasm sought to be bridged by the constitution? It imposes upon the world of fact a world of value, and the fact that human beings have particular disposition or qualities does not mean that these are normatively unimpeachable. What is important is that just as behavior is a product of the interaction between genes and environment, we must also bear in mind that from a factual observation alone, you cannot come to a claim of value. And this was actually pursued substantially by two great philosophers, David Hume and G.E. Moore. I also need to say that there are problems in evolutionary associations determining our conditions and ignoring the close connection between values and ethics, which we seek to bring upon them by means of these two words, democracy and the Constitution. Democracy was first the initial process, as Plato said. Notwithstanding the reservations of multiple opinions contradicting each other, democracy is a veritable means of coming together of people to have shared objectives. Our Constitution rejects the fundamental premise that our evolutionary condition must give us the right to vanquish or gives us the freedom to overlook those who are less privileged or less strong. We are not able to deny that by random chance we could just have been the other person, namely the disadvantaged, the oppressed, and the depressed. Purely random chance. We can at best only know sufficiently about our own DNA, but what is important is that while DNA is relevant for science, the Constitution imposes a value that you do not stigmatize people based upon what they look like, what they feel like, and what they want to say. You give them space. You give them sovereignty, personal sovereignty. So one does look at the Kantian theory that we must therefore have a just ethical system. It is important that we are not using the word moral here, but we are using the word ethical, which is about character. And here the word is in the context of rational and coherent collection of universalized principles. Sometimes there can be ethnocentricity, xenophobia, territoriality, and aggression. All these are contraindicated by the two expressions, democracy and constitution. The central task of any system of ethics is the construction of the impartial perspective, bearing in mind that environment can substantially influence conduct, but in the interaction between genes and environment, we must have a credible ethical structure. That is what is provided by the Constitution. How is that human nature going to adapt itself to altruism, social justice, and we have hints of this in the Constitution. Even genetic biases can be trespassed, passions can be averted, redirected, and that is something which is also indicated by the Constitution. Yet, if the fundamental point is that we must not allow the mere fact of our birth to either defeat us or to place us in a position of advantage, our birth as humans is intended to place us in a position of giving respect and according fairness. If you're free, then you're also able to assume responsibility. The Constitution therefore removes you from a certain degree of fatalism or determinism. If our actions are determined, we are not responsible for them, or if they are the result of random events, we are again not responsible. The Constitution provides you a place and a space where you can be nurtured. Of course, the environment must be one which is suitable to nurture in one's setting, through one's family and others. That is why the state is a greater caregiver in the Indian context. The Constitution also contemplates that in order to ensure political justice, we have a very severely independent election commission. In order to ensure that there is economic justice, apart from the fact that as a matter of governance, there is a severe influence of the directive principles of state policy, there is also the institution of the Controller and Auditor General as a matter of protection. In order to ensure that there is equal opportunity, the Constitution has enabled rules to be framed for services. The Constitution has vested authority in institutions like the Public Service Commission, not for the purpose of favors, but for the purpose of ensuring inclusion, for the purpose of ensuring merit, for the purpose of ensuring fairness, and for the purpose of enlisting the highest canons of justice. The legislature is very vital. The debates within the legislature are equally important. Unfortunately, because of the theory of a whip, and this expression whip is, I think, out of place in contemporary humanistic terminology. This word whip was actually devised for the purpose of whipping foxes to hunt hounds. And it became a part of political terminology which has been borrowed by us. It is somewhat a dehumanizing term, but it has a certain degree of connotation, which is that even people who belong to a political party, when in governance, feel that they do not have the right to question the executive government. And that is something very seriously exceptional. Article 105 gave that special freedom to enable people who even belong to a governing party to bring to the fore of the legislature and ask questions. And I sincerely believe that the democracy which must exist in legislatures is not simply between a ruling party and the opposition, or others as they call it, but also it involves the ability to question and to effect posers, even by those who are within the party, to put questions in the conduct of parliamentary or legislative business is the heart and soul of legislative activity, apart from, of course, enactment of the statutes and other legislative measures. Stephen Holmes stressed that much writing by philosophers and social scientists through the years has been about a certain problem: how to constrain the irrational, the destructive, sometimes even self-destructive behavior. This is something where these two concepts of democracy and the Constitution assist us. A Constitution disables what we call as operant behaviorism, which is based only on considerations of narrow self-interest. I'm going to touch upon a point from the standpoint of psychology. The importance of cognition is a feature of the Indian Constitution. Just as we have the brain, which is like rest of the organs in the body, it is evolved for certain specific functions, which is to process information and would help human beings to survive. There are a number of subrational motivations and passions. Sometimes there is an irrational and intolerant adherence to a principle which is incapable of definition. Sometimes there is strange animosity. Sometimes there is love of imitation. Sometimes there is psychological infatuation with a leader. Sometimes there's a craving for approval, anger, envy, fear, grief. All these are complex personal emotions. But if the Constitution is to be lived, and we treat it not simply as a social charter, but we also look at this somewhat more profoundly as guiding us, you will find that the best of reason and the best of guidance, the best of inclusion, and the best of protection for individual thinking is to be found in the Constitution. I do not, of course, say that it is a psychotherapeutic document, but definitely it is a document which is founded on very deep philosophical principles. What is this common denominator between democracy and the Constitution? In democracy, we all come together. But there is a delegation which will ensure that the rights of all are protected. The manner in which this is achieved is by the Constitution. But the Constitution then becomes a charter for the authority, both for control as well as exercise. Constitutionalism means you adhere to the Constitution in its spirit. Unless this is understood, errors can happen by merely a formalistic observance of the Constitution. It can lead to assumption of excessive authority. Article 21 is the bedrock of dignity and the human persona. But human dignity is also in the bedrock of democracy. It implies that we will have personal autonomy. We, of course, are guaranteed political autonomy because of political justice. We are assured political justice under the Constitution. When we see this expression, political justice, we have the capacity to participate in governance directly by voting, but more importantly, indirectly, effectively, by voicing opinions, exercising the right to free speech, and being critical of governmental actions. Since democracy is substantially a political form, a constitution, however, becomes an instrument of political control. A constitution has two kinds of provisions, and it has two forms there. It has an outer form, which is the procedural form, but the content is always substantive. But most importantly, our Constitution actually propounds the principle of legality. It enshrines the rule of law. I do think that you're all familiar with formal and substantive attributes of the Constitution. Winston Churchill did express his lack of confidence in respect of democracy in the Indian context. We always believe that we had proved him wrong, and we should believe that. However, there was one observation which he made, that many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in the world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. This is, of course, a slightly reducive statement. I think we need to move forward from that position. Today, democracy can be a positive, proactive means of both individual and social good. Two attributes of a democracy. One is the elected government, and the second is the distribution of powers. But an important point is the role of the judiciary is vital. And I'll come to it in just a moment. In 1938, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan gave a speech in Madras. It's a very telling speech. He was, of course, a philosopher, deeply perceptive, and he explained the difference between a hollow democracy and a true democracy. What is the difference? He said, one has a technical architecture, and you simply follow the architecture. But if you follow it with your spirit and state of mind, then that is the spirit of democracy. There was a sentence which is said, and that has always stayed with me. We have to realize that democracy is not a mere political arrangement, but a habit of mind. It is easy to acquire the forms of democracy, but not so easy to get its spirit, that sensitive adjustment of the self to infinitely various demands of other persons. I want to say something here. There is a very natural tendency for us to quickly segregate ourselves from another person. We are guided by considerations of self-interest, but what comes to the instinctive fore sometimes is actually the sense of authority or perceived superiority in which we are with relation to the other person. If suppose what Dr. Radhakrishnan said is correct, that it is a habit of the mind, we will have to practice what is entrenched equality, even in our thoughts. And it is certainly a process worth considering. Dr. Radhakrishnan's speech is one of the great contributions to understand the Indian Constitution, and that too delivered in 1938. What about the right to vote? Hugo Black said, "No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which we must live." There has been studies of the Indian electoral scene. We have had the first electoral roll prepared between November 47 and the late 1949. We began the path of even becoming a democracy even before we adopted a constitution. We became voters before we became citizens. Then the first elections were conducted between 25th October 51 and 21st February 1952. But there are two important decisions. There is a decision of the Canadian Supreme Court which said that all forms of democratic government are founded upon the right to vote. Without that right, democracy cannot exist. The marking of a ballot is the mark of distinction of citizens of a democracy. It is a proud badge of freedom. I think it is a very pertinent observation. But mere voting is not enough. It is the idea of the universal adult franchise, of a vote for every man and woman that a true democracy would guarantee. This is an idea which must capture the very spirit of our Constitution. For a poor, illiterate populace, which throws off the colonial yoke, being given moral regard to the ability to choose their leaders is something very special. But it is important that what led to freedom must always be continued freedom. A must not be substituted by B. What is important is that we as fellow citizens must know that the ability to vote is a special badge. But even political parties must know that votes of citizens are matters of badges of honor. They are not badges which are meant to be subjected to incentives or to be garnered or to be intimidated. And most importantly, in today's world, which is very, very technologically advanced, is not meant to be overcome by fake news, trolls, and algorithmically highly manipulated possibilities in messaging and in the social media. I say this with considerable respect because all political parties today have a greater responsibility in democracy. To preserve democracy and the Constitution, they cannot look at the citizenry as objects or persons who should be subject to manipulation. This is very vital. This also brings into fore a connected topic which is relevant for democracy, which is about the inordinate amount of money which flows in from businesses or whatever for funding. This is important. It has to be addressed. While we do have elections and we do respect democratic verdicts, there's no reason why they should not be respected. But there are some issues which have to be addressed. One of the important tributes which could be paid was to the late Mr. Swaminathan, who was the election commissioner. We had only one election commissioner. That is when the Janata government came to power. He had ensured that the elections were completely free and fair. And an incumbent government, which was center stage in the Indian political arena, was completely displaced. But there are some important aspects here which are relevant both for democracy and the Constitution. When we talk about an effective, independent election commission, we mean truly independent. We mean it is independent in terms of appointment, it is independent in terms of quality, it is independent in terms of its functioning. That's one part. But second is, even in ensuring the very process of election, the election commission is not entirely powerless to consider some of the issues which I have highlighted. Because everything cannot be left till the last moment. Today, you have data which is now analyzed by so many of these analytical companies all over the world, which have such a perfect profile about you. You're not as sovereign as you think you are. Your tastes are known. Everything about you is known once you are logged on to something called the internet. But the ability to manipulate you by knowing what you like or what people or segments like, this is a form of information gathering. But the ability to message you, to make you believe, can create in democracy a small disconnect between what appears to be and what is. In democracy, to be true and effective, that has to be completely evaporated. Who is going to be able to do that? That brings me to a point here. That can only be an independent press and an independent media. Indian Express had a building in Delhi. It was sought to be demolished by an order of the Lieutenant Governor. It challenged it in the Supreme Court. The order was quashed. But it was an important point. The independence of the freedom of speech and expression is the only way in which people will have the ability to pierce through this wheel of perception and fact. I never forget that Bernard Coleman was one of the companies which challenged a newsprint control order and succeeded in the Supreme Court. It was a very important decision. Who will not be able to pay a tribute to the late Khushbu Irani, a man who was constantly questioning authority? He was one of the most important figures of the Indian press. The Indian press is very vital for democracy. This is the point. However well somebody may be doing, sometimes contrarianism is very essential for the sake of democracy. Contrarianism per se is vital for democracy. And this is something which has to be embedded in history. There is no sole rider in a democracy. There has to be another point of view. However reasonable one point of view may be, but you still have to have a panoply of points of view, which is why the South African Constitutional Court, in a very famous case called August, it said, "The vote of each and every citizen is a badge of dignity and personhood." Quite literally, it says that everybody counts. In a country of great disparities of wealth and power, it declares that whoever we are, whether rich or poor, exalted or disgraced, we all belong to the same democratic South African nation, that our destinies are intertwined in a single interactive polity. This has to be perceived. This is important. Always there is a conflict between us and them. Us means somebody who is in great authority. But even political parties must know they're only servants of people. It is not us and them being the citizens or the voters. Section 62(5) of the Representation of People Act is somewhat of an obstacle, although its validity has been upheld. But I'm concerned that whether people who are still awaiting trial should be permitted to vote or not. I think there is some room to believe that they should not be disenfranchised merely because they are put in prison. There is another point which I would like to share with you, that the voting age in all jurisdictions is not 18. In some countries, it is 16. There is also another aspect which I would like to share with you, or have a dialogue with you, is, don't you think that one of the serious impediments in democracy can be what is called as apathy? the failure of citizens to vote due to lack of turnout, and that has been something which has been a part of a narrative in some states. Why should not there be a duty to vote? A statutory obligation to vote. Because voting in percentages can even make big differences to outcomes. Small percentages can make huge differences to outcomes. Therefore, why should it not be considered by the Election Commission that, except of course, unless you are incapable of voting due to various medical or certain other circumstances, why should it not be a compelling duty to vote? This is a point to be considered. It makes every citizen accountable also to democracy, because apathy is not an individualistic characteristic. Collectively, it has the effect, in my view, of distancing yourself from democracy. There's a second point. There should be a consensus on the nature of political science education, which should be introduced in schools, particularly with reference to the Constitution, the rights of an individual and the duties of an individual. It is a very important subject. As a consequence of, shall we say, the early onset of intelligence and cognition in generations of today, we could possibly revisit even the ability to vote at an earlier age, although this may involve considerable degree of consultation, and undoubtedly it should. But it will give a larger slice of people to consider the democratic process in its dimensions. This is only food for thought. This is having regard to the way in which certain percentages have affected very major outcomes. For instance, I'll give you an example of Brexit. In Brexit, it was a very small percentage, and sometimes percentages of Remainers who didn't vote because it rained on that day. Just imagine, the outcome was so serious for a country. But I do believe that these should be considered by authorities, including the Election Commission. I now come to the judiciary. There has been a certain perception that because of this constant message being sent out that all organs have to function together, all coexist, namely the legislature, executive, and the judiciary, and therefore there is mutual respect. And this idea of mutual respect is definitely accurate, but it has a certain limitation. The idea of mutual respect is not the soul of a judiciary. A judiciary is actually the safety valve in the Constitution for the people of India. The judiciary is the only, and now I'm using this word very cautiously, the only counter-majoritarian institution in the Constitution. It's the only one which can question whether it is an executive government or executive authorities under an elected government, or the elected government, or for that matter of fact, a legislative act. So, in formalistic terms, mutual respect is perfectly justified. It is true, because everybody has a certain coordinateness in the Constitution. But sometimes this expression of mutual respect must never displace what is the nature of the judicial function or the adjudicatory function, which is in a sense a counter-majoritarian function. It is the function which has been accorded in India by the Constitution to courts. And therefore, the spirit of the Constitution itself has accorded to the courts the ability and the independence to be counter-majoritarian. I say this because this is how the courts and the Supreme Court and High Courts in various ways have helped citizens to cultivate what Dr. Radhakrishnan said, habits of the mind. This is therefore the engine of Indian democracy, courts, because they are the ones who actually uncover, and I'm using a somewhat Marxian metaphor, the ones who uncover form and content in action are the courts. They are the ones who are meant to see through the illusions and accord justice in accordance with the Constitution. The Constitution has enough indicia of what is a judicial function about. The independence of the judiciary is so vital because it is the engine of the Constitution. You have other parts of the Constitution, other very important functionaries in the Constitution. But this is very important equally, to be in ever watchfulness, which is why there has always been a lot of reflection amongst great judges, and there has been no shortage of or paucity of great judges. And some of their portraits hang in various courts, the Supreme Court, the various high courts, very distinguished judges who have been beacons of character, self-restraint, and above all, the ability to universalize their consciousness by impersonality. The greater the judge, the more humble he is, the greater he is, the more impersonal and the more universalized he is. These facets of compassion are not only individual, they're also institutional. So when I spoke of compassionate constitutionalism, the element of compassion also permeates with the judiciary, permeates into the judicial function. And the judiciary is therefore a great sentinel. It is a very important instrument to safeguard our rights, our liberties, but most importantly, to consider the present conditions and at moments we uphold executive function, executive work. There are times when one has to interfere. No moment is permanent. There is nothing called a permanent moment. At every moment, the judiciary has to review what needs to be done, particularly having regard to its role under the Constitution. The use of the expression social distancing must really mean only physical distancing. It is a phrase which has become a bit extant in all countries in the context of physical distancing. But in our context, it only means physical, it does not mean that there is us and them. I say this again in the context of the fact that we do have to reach out to all segments of society, from migrant workers, even to people who are in self-employed capacities, professions, who have all been hit by this very extraordinary disease. The migrant workers are in a plight which is incapable of articulation. No amount of photographs or even moving videos can ever recoup what they have undergone or are still undergoing. And sometimes the moral question does crop up. Is there going to be a puzzle? Are we so relatively important and superior that for our protection they must suffer? It is the moral question. Not a very easy answer. It is a dilemma. But they deserve the first look and consideration. We must also know at this moment one of the most important functions of the state is nutritional improvement, because there is a nexus between lack of nutrition and a virus spread. The concern which I have is migrant workers, they leave their ration cards at home. We have an extraordinary number of migrant workers in India. And at this time of harvesting, one must think of farmers. India will also need food supplies. Our food banks may be very well today, but we have to look at possibilities of the unknown future. The farmers need to be protected. They have to be incentivized, not by cash crops at this moment. These are, of course, executive decisions. But I'm saying all this comes within the ambit of all of us thinking of others as well, which is a part of the democratic trait. The part of democratic trait is not simply self-interest, but to consider this entire complex of society. We have people less privileged who are not able to go back home. We have people who are completely malnutritioned. All these will require great attention. And I do believe that one of the institutions which must start affording access as quickly as possible will be courts, because access to justice can never be suspended. I do know, and I'm very grateful that by reason of technology, the Supreme Courts, the High Courts are conducting hearing important cases. But regular access to justice is very, very vital. All said and done, however much technologically we are advanced, as lawyers, our ability to leverage technology to undertake legal proceedings is not always uniform. We must respect that it is not a uniform feature in our courts. It may be a feature in some courts, it may be a feature with some judges and lawyers, but it's not a feature of our legal system. We might need to work towards it, having regard to the requirements of efficiency and the ability to give greater access. These are two very broad themes, but I have spoken about them today with some element of irony and also a sense of poignancy, because we are in a state of relative uncertainty. This is not to decry that our innate resolve to be positive must always triumph over adversity. We have resilience, and we have seen the worst of situations in Tamil Nadu, and lawyers, civil society, government, all have come together to overcome them. So positivity is absolutely the need of the hour. But positivity, unmindful of reality, is not going to help us. It is positivism, which is cognizant of reality, which will further our condition in the right direction. As I said, some aspects of my conversation today are grounded on precedent, literature, and past practice. Some are thoughts to engage in a conversation and reflection. Some are my own hopes, which I have shared with you. I've had the great privilege of seeing the lectures of very eminent and learned judges on this website. I was able to see Honorable Justice Rama Subramaniam's lecture and Honorable Justice Indu Malhotra's lecture, marked by great learning, and it only tells us that judges don't actually abstain from work. They keep on working, they keep on reading, and it's a significant tribute to our institutions. And I do believe that all of you are also reading and working, and this is the time also to reflect. It is a pause button in our lives, but every pause button has its own advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, it gives us time to think. It gives us time to think about ourselves, but more importantly, it gives us a time to think about the universe, about what is happening around us. In every one of us is Prometheus unbound. The greatest potential kinetic energy exists in every one of us. The Constitution is only a great charter by which we can unleash those capacities within us. And I hope that all of you will be able to fulfill your dreams, your capacities, your visions, and ambitions to the best possible manner. Thank you.